Welcome to PCS Insight. We are today going to talk about sustainable securitization. We will wait a couple of minutes for everybody to join. In the meantime, I'd like to share some of the information we're going to go through and a bit of the agenda. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And we're going to talk about the background to ESG and capital markets, any rules, existing rules on ESG and what is coming. And also we're going to share to you where we think the battle lines are forming. Joining me today will be Ian Bell and Max Brunsware. As you probably are aware, unless you've been living in a different planet for the last 2 years, there's a lot of discussion about green, about climate, about sustainability. And now green is left, right, and center of any legislation and any talk. Max, you have been one of the pioneers of green securitization during your time at Obvion with Green Storm. What are your thoughts?
Maybe we should wait like a minute before, starting as people are still joining.
While we're waiting, Ian, for more people to join, I'd like to say that just in 2020 alone, there were almost 350 billion of funds raised just for ESG purposes, and over 700 new ESG funds that were created for the purpose of investing in ESG. So I think there's a lot of interest. Max, I think we can start, and I'll give the mic back to you. You're on mute, Max.
So shall we start?
Yeah.
All right. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you, Harry. In 2016, Obvion issued its inaugural Green RMBS under the Storm program. Green Storm 2016 was the world's first Green RMBS. And now, 5 years on, Obvion has issued some 2.5 billion under the Green Storm program. And leaving Fannie Mae as a US government agency aside, that makes Obvion the fourth largest issuer of green asset-backed bonds in the world. And that's great. What's not so great is that the total volume of green asset-backed bonds should be so much higher by now, 5 years on, than it is. The Earth, and we as human beings, are on a trajectory of catastrophic climate change that will end the world as we know it. And it's only with the green transition that is unprecedented in scale and speed that we could steer away from that trajectory. And the bad news is that it's highly uncertain if we will be able to pull this off. The good news is that it is still possible and there is still time, although time is running out lightning fast. And the good news is also that the enormous investments that are needed for this transition, trillions of euros, dollars, and pounds, these funds are available through capital markets in the world. But to achieve that, green bond markets worldwide will have to grow exponentially almost. And green bonds are therefore not a nice to have, they are a must have. And green is not something for the future as well, it's already here. If we look at the European situation, the source of all legislation regarding green bonds, green securitization, what have you, in Europe lies in the European Green Deal, which was concluded in December 2019. It came into force in July of this year, and it aims to reduce carbon emission by 45% in the year 2030. And actually be net zero in year 2015. No lack of ambition, and that's very, very necessary. Leaving aside for the moment the external factors that are currently inhibiting development of the the European securitization market in general, to achieve the goals of the Green Deals, we need a couple of things. We need a clear and workable set of definitions of what qualifies as a green bond. And we need a workable framework, a standard for green bonds, and effective but realistic disclosure requirements. Those are elements which are imperative if we want to develop the green securitization market. Back to you, Harry.
Thanks, Max. I think, Ian, you have spent a considerable amount of time going through the myriad of proposals, legislation, and papers that are out there regarding green. What is your view? What have you seen so far? Where are they all leading to?
Is go from the larger to the smaller in the sense that all legislative initiatives, all legislative requirements within green are a bit like those matryoshka dolls in Russia. You have the Green Deal, which is then in law in the climate law, and then there are bigger legislative proposals, which are framework proposals, until you get to the stuff that directly impacts securitization and will directly impact securitization in the near future. But I think in order to understand those much more kind of granular pieces of legislation that will directly impact securitization, you need to understand the bigger dolls, if you want, because otherwise it looks like a very technical subject where you don't understand exactly why this is being required. So, as Max told you, the European Green Deal, now in law in the European climate law, is the basic starting point. The smaller doll after that is, in fact, there are two of them, are the taxonomy regulation and the European Union's proposed green bond standard. These are macro laws, if you want, that apply to all of finance in the first case and all of capital markets in the second case. And all the specific rules that we're going to discuss, the ones that exist already, the ones that are coming down the line very quickly, all of those rules flow from the taxonomy regulation. The taxonomy regulation, which passed in 2020, came into force almost immediately, basically is the definition of green. It is the European Union telling you what qualifies as green. They use the word sustainable, but we use the word green, which is the same word for these purposes, right? And people hear about ESG, remember that taxonomy is about the E, the environmental in ESG, which the social and governance is really not part of that yet. So the taxonomy regulation was passed 2 years ago, and it has three purposes. One is to avoid greenwashing, which is the expression used for people claiming that their product is green, but really it isn't. Avoiding fragmentation. So basically the idea here is that taxonomy is a way to make sure that from Latvia to Portugal, something is defined as green encompasses the same kind of things. And equally, something that will not be deemed green in the Netherlands would not be deemed green in Croatia. And the final aim of the taxonomy, it's explicit in the taxonomy, but it's not very clear how the European Union is going to achieve that, is to use the taxonomy to sort of move investments towards the green space. But as we'll see in, I think, the last slide of this presentation, how that's going to be done is still a little bit unclear, and for good reason. The taxonomy itself is actually quite simple. If you were to read the taxonomy regulation, the operative bits of the taxonomy regulation will take you no more than 10 minutes, 15 minutes. What it does is it sets out 6 categories of the things that are sustainable. So activities, in order to be sustainable, have to fall in one of the 6 categories. we've set them out in this slide. There's a lot of slides where we have a lot of information for you to take home and read and go back to if you want to remind yourself. We're not going to go through all of them because there's a lot of information here. But in this slide, we have set out the 6 categories of things that are green. By the way, as you can tell, I'm in front of a window and the sky is very kind of changeable. So at times it does look like I'm speaking to you from a witness protection program. I'm actually speaking to you from our office. So the taxonomy regulation has these 6 environmental objectives. As I said, the operative bit of the regulation is very, very short. But that's because the European Union has left a huge amount of the actual definition of green to delegated acts. And we already have the first of these delegated acts came out in July of this year. It only covers 2 of the 6 objectives, and yet it is already 512 pages long. And this, the reason we mention this is that we're trying to convey to you the fact that the taxonomy regulation, once it gets filled in by the delegated acts, is going to be a monstrous piece of regulation with incredibly insane details. And that's going to make it very, very challenging for people who want to play in the green space. The other thing which is interesting about the delegated act, of course, is it's also very controversial. Many of you will have seen the stories recently about controversies about gas, nuclear. Those flow from this delegated act. The controversies emerged when the delegated act came out. Nuclear and gas, the French want nuclear because they think it's green. The Germans are opposed to it. On the other hand, the Germans want gas because they think it's a transitional technology. The French are opposed to it. There are lots of controversies. The Commission did what it usually does when it faces large controversies, which is kick the can down the road. So nuclear and gas will be looked at later. But the 2 things we need to take away is that the taxonomy sets out these 6 areas. The delegated act is monstrously large and is going to go on growing, and it's very controversial. So that's the first, if you want, smaller matryoshka doll, which anchors the whole of green financial law in the EU, will be the taxonomy. We'll go back to the taxonomy again and again and again. The second bit, which is not yet law, is the European Green Bond Standard, the EU Green Bond Standard. There was a technical experts group. If you never hear of it again, it's because it was renamed. It's now called the Platform on Sustainable Finance, but it's the same group of individuals. Set out a report about what a green bond should be. So we know what green is as an activity. What should a green bond be? That report led to a draft piece of legislation, which came out again this July. And is now in front of Parliament and Council. So in the coming months, we don't know how long this will take, but we will have a law which will set out the European Green Bond Standard and will say, if you want to call yourself a European Green Bond, then these are the conditions you will have to meet. So not your law yet, but certainly coming quickly. So what are those conditions? Well, there are 4 key points in the proposal made by the Commission to the Parliament, to the Council. And of course, this may change, right? The Parliament and the Council may decide to change this dramatically. I suspect not, but you never know, it is politics. So the first thing is, it's a proceeds-based approach. A green bond basically is a bond where the money raised by the borrowing goes to a taxonomy-compliant activity. And you saw what those are. As I said to you, we'll come back and again to the taxonomy. Everything goes back to the taxonomy in the European Union when it comes to sustainability. So a green bond is a bond whose funds go to the taxonomy. And the 3 other requirements of the Green Bond Standard as drafted, again, it's a draft, are that there has to be full transparency. So you have to explain exactly how your money is raised is going to go to green. And secondly, because the European Union is suspicious of the financial world, they also have insisted that the greenness, if you want, of your bond be checked externally by an independent party. So it's not just a question of the issuer promising to do green. There's a requirement for an external verification, a bit like an audit. And furthermore, because, as I said, the European Union is really not trusting the financial world, that those independent observers are going to have to be themselves regulated by ESMA. So we're going to see how much of this survives in the final draft, in the final law, sorry. But my guess is actually most of it probably will. But then again, I could be wrong.
Ian, thank you for that. But it looks like a lot of the requirements are based on disclosure. It's about disclosure. What's the rationale that it's the Commission, the European Union is based on disclosure, and it's kind of going to add the greenness or test from a disclosure point of view? Why are they starting from that point?
Okay. So the idea here is that you've defined green, and one of the primary aims of the legislation and various pieces of legislation is to avoid greenwashing, as well as to move investments towards green. And the two keys to avoid greenwashing, but also to create, if you want, a moral pressure towards investing in green, is to have disclosure of the greenness or not of your products. And we're going to come to that in the next phase. The idea being that people will want to invest in green. As you mentioned, over $350 billion were raised in 2020 alone. 700 funds were set up just for green. The idea is that if you force people to disclose how green their products are, they will move towards green in order to attract money, as well as to protect their reputation. These days, nobody wants to be seen as a brown player in the markets. And so this is where we now move from the big picture, the taxonomy, the green bond standard, what is green and what is green bond, to existing pieces of legislation that will affect indirectly green securitization. And there are two kinds of rules here. There are the ones I said which will affect indirectly securitization or already affecting indirectly securitization. And then there are rules which will specific to securitization or will be specific to securitization. So, of the rules that are already in place and that affect already securitization indirectly is the SFDR. First one that we're going to deal with, SFDR. SFDR is the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. It was passed in 2019, and it came into force this year. And basically, you'll see there's a lot of slides. We've got a lot of explanations about what SFDR does in detail, but I don't want to bore you with all of that, so you can go back to the slides and look at them at your leisure. But basically, what you need to know in the context of securitization, because there are other contexts for SFDR. SFDR imposes obligations on other market participants. But what you need to know in the context of securitization is that fund managers, all kinds of fund managers, alternative investment funds, UCITS, you see, but basically fund managers now need to disclose a whole variety of things about themselves, their own policies, including remuneration policies, but about their products, about their funds. And these are mandatory requirements. So as I said, I'm not going to go through all these slides. This tells you who's affected by SFDR. These are the things that they have to disclose as individuals, not as individuals, they're companies, but as actors, if you want. And they have to disclose things about their product, and it tells you when you have to disclose it, etc. Again, you can see the slides here. And these are the types of products which they have to disclose. The disclosures are mandatory. They come into force on June 2022. So technically, it's another 9 months before you have to start filing these disclosures publicly. But of course, it's like an accounting period. You file backwards for your funds. So as of 2021, June 2021, already you're buying, you're selling, you're performing activities that will require reporting at the end of the period, and which is why we know that investors are already requiring issuers to provide them with the type of information that they will need in order to fulfill their obligations under SFDR. Ultimately, by 2022, these obligations will be the subject matter of templates. For those of you who are in securitization, you're familiar with the ESMA templates for disclosure and securitization. Well, there'll be similar types of templates about what needs to be disclosed. But in the meantime, there is a draft regulatory technical standard which has been issued by the Joint Committee of the ESAs in February of this year. If you want to read it, I warn you, it's 195 pages long. So you can read that after you read the 512 pages of the taxonomy, if you have an awful lot of time. But basically, the ESAs have said until the regulatory technical standard is actually law, which will probably be sometime in 2022, you can basically use this information. Now, why does this matter? And we're going to come back to NFRD, and we're going to go back for 449A in the next few minutes. But why does this matter? It matters because going forward, these disclosures are going to be mandatory. And now they don't require you to disclose line by line. For the moment, we don't know where it will end up, but line by line on every product you buy. But at the end of the day, any fund manager who buys a securitization or any other instrument, an equity, a corporate debt, is going to need to fill in a form effectively describing what their fund's environmental impact is. And therefore, either they're going to get the information from the issuer or the originator in a securitization, or if they don't get it, they're still going to have to fill in the form, which means they're going to have to do their own research one way or another. It is likely already, and even more so in the future, that unless you're able to provide the information that asset managers want to be able to fill in the SFDR obligations, that your bond is going to be very unattractive. Simply, the compliance department of the fund manager is going to say, listen, if you can't get the information that allows me to fill in my end of year SFDR disclosure, frankly, don't buy it. Don't buy it, or buy it, but you have to do your own work. And the credit analyst is going to say, listen, I'm a credit analyst, I'm not a sustainability analyst. So in order to be able to sell to asset managers as a securitization, you're going to need to start thinking about what kind of disclosure they want. One of the things we're hearing already from issuers in our practice is that every investor is going out there with their own specific bespoke requests, so standardization is going to be needed. So this is something that the industry is going to need to look at, well, actually has to look at now, not is going to need to look at in the future. The other issue, and this is an issue again that's going to be raised in NFRD, which is going to be the next slide, and 449A, which is going to be the next slide, is that, as we saw, the European Union is using the taxonomy and the disclosure, as we said, to morally force, if you want, investors towards green. That means that if you cannot show that your securitization is green, it is likely that a number of investor doors will be closed to you, because those investors will say, even if I'm not putting a green fund together, I don't want my disclosure, which is going to be public under SFDR, to disclose the fact that either I have no idea how brown my fund is, or that it's completely brown, right? Even if I'm not running a sustainable fund, I would like to be able to report under SFDR that my fund is actually not a bad actor in the sustainability space. And therefore, we're going to talk about the green asset ratio also, same thing. You're going to have banks saying, I would rather not buy something where I can't say it's either green or at least it has zero impact. It's neither green nor brown. And so that's why it's going to be important going forward that securitization can be green. And we're going to discuss this much later on when Max is going to talk about the battlegrounds. Those battlegrounds are about making sure that there is a space in the green ecology. There is a niche in the green ecology for securitization, and that we are not in a situation where, for technical or legislative reasons, we cannot play in that space. NFRDR, sorry, is the first one of those. The next one is NFRD. It's extremely irritating because one is DR, disclosure regulation, the other one is RD, reporting directive. NFRD is actually an old piece of legislation. It flows out of actually an even older piece of legislation, which is the 2013 accounting directive. 2013, before 2013, all listed companies, large companies in Europe, reported their financial statements in a different way, had the different requirements, different levels of disclosure. 2013, the European Union passed the accounting directive, and the aim of the accounting directive, clues in the name, was to ensure that all European listed large companies would report their balance sheet and profit and loss roughly on the same basis with the same level of disclosure. A year later, it was decided to do the same for the non-financial reporting that companies were required to make. There's a lot of things such as, remuneration of directors, conflicts of interest, largest shareholdings. There's a whole variety of non-financial disclosures required, and 2014 was an opportunity through the non-financial reporting directive to harmonize that at a European level again, so that a Dutch company and a Greek company, a Polish company and an Italian company disclose the same level of information, the same type of information. So this is, as I said, 2014. It's been in place for a while, and it gets amended from time to time. People say, oh, we should disclose this, we should disclose that. In Article 8 of the taxonomy regulation, the European Union was told you should add to the non-financial reporting directive disclosure on green, disclosure on sustainability. And this, therefore, is going through. It was adopted as delegated act in July. July was a very busy month for sustainability. And it sets out the disclosures that need to be made under Article 8. So again, this is a very big picture disclosure. We're talking about listed companies. But, interestingly enough, listed companies include banks and insurance companies. And that means that every bank is going to have to disclose information about its business and how sustainable its business is. And since the business of banks is lending, it's going to have to disclose information about lending and sustainability. That adds to another sustainability disclosure, which is Article 449A of the CRR. It's a Pillar 3 requirement of CRR. Applies to all banks from June of next year. And there, the EBA has basically said, in addition to the general NFRD requirements that you have to do as a listed company, there are specific bank-related sustainability requirements. And you can see them. I'm not going to go through them. They're on the slide. Now, this is still being discussed. There's a consultation that went out in March, and there's a survey that's gone out in September from the EBA to banks asking this. But as you can see, funds, SFDR, banks, NFRD, insurance companies, NFRD, banks specifically 449A, everybody is now required to disclose a large amount of information about sustainability. Now, I will remind people that the bank bid is 30% of every securitization pretty much sold in Europe. Obviously, it depends on asset class, tenor, etc. But roughly 30% of all asset-backed deals are bought by banks, and therefore bank disclosure requirements are also going to start imposing obligations on issuers.
I mean, let's say for a second, I am an issuer or I am an investor. If I put everything you said so far together, where does that lead me? I mean, what do I need to comply with? What disclosure I need to comply with?
Okay. So for the moment, technically, you don't have to comply with anything. You, as an issuer, could issue with the zero sustainability information. You can just say, you know what, it's not my problem. The bank, you are the guys who have to disclose something under 449A. Asset managers, you're the guys who have to disclose under the SFDR. not my problem, you figure it out. The problem is that a bit like LCR, we know that some securitizations are eligible for the liquidity coverage ratios and others are not. It's not a ban. You can issue a non-LCR eligible securitization, sell it to a bank. But we also know that what has happened is because banks would like to use those securitizations in the LCR pool, what's happened is that Bank Treasury says, you know what? I've got two securitizations in front of me. One of them is LCR eligible, one of them isn't. I'm going to buy the LCR eligible one unless there's some overwhelming reason not to. And I think what we're going to see is something similar to that. Of course, as an issuer, you don't have to disclose anything about securitization of green, or you don't have to meet any of the green requirements if you can. But if your competitor is prepared to disclose, and if your competitor is prepared to meet the taxonomy definition, you're going to see that many asset managers are going to say, you know, at equal spread or in the same maturity range, I'm going to go for the guy who discloses, because it means that I can fill in my SFDR 449A or NFRD requirements.
Close anything, or
yeah,
it doesn't matter?
Yeah, if you're an asset manager, you do SFDR. So if you look at the bid, you've got the bank bid, 449A, NFRD. You've got the asset manager bid, which is SFDR. So yeah, you can sell to the ECB and you can sell to sovereign funds.
I don't have to disclose, but I need to worry about what disclosure the investors will have to.
Correct. And ultimately, you know, for some investors, those disclosures are going to be mandatory. Their internal compliance department are basically going to say, listen, we have legal obligations to disclose. If you cannot get the information from the issuer or from some other public source, then we're not going to allow you. We, the compliance department, are going to say you can't buy it. So there's no doubt that in the coming months, years, this is going to have an impact on your capacity to sell, your spread.
Experience when I've talked to investors that keep telling me that every year they get a bigger KPI requirement of what quota of their investments needs to be green. 2 years ago, it was close to zero. Last year was 10-20%. This year is higher. Do you see that as well? Do you requests for investors to start filling a bucket of green assets or sustainable assets?
Yes, I think that going forward, along the lines that Ian discussed, the same holds for investors for all kinds of information and all kinds of obligations they have. I mean, we're no longer in a simple world where an investor, a fund manager, a portfolio manager decides whether he likes the investment as such, whether the spread is okay and the risk is okay. There's so much more that is coming into play when making investment decisions and surrounding the framework for a portfolio manager, that I think this trend will continue, absolutely.
And I think the point, Max, and how you make is also important. So I've talked about disclosure. If you don't disclose, you may find it difficult to sell. But of course, there is even more fundamentally whether or not your securitization does meet the definition of green. And this takes me to my next slide, which is that through 449A and NFRD, the EBA has proposed a new metric for all banks in Europe to fill. And that metric is what's known as the green asset ratio. It's not particularly complicated. The name basically tells you what it is. Banks are going to have to report how much of their assets are green. Green, again, defined by reference to the taxonomy. It's not going to be a self-defined category. So this is going to not only require banks to get the information, and then therefore back to my old disclosure point, but also it's going to be putting pressure on banks to buy green assets. Nobody's going to want to have the lowest green asset ratio on the block. And again, just like LCR, we would expect in the coming months and years a lot of bank senior management telling their treasury, listen, if you're going to buy something for the treasury, then I want it to be green. If it's not green, then you're going to have a special permission. You're going to have to come back and explain why you want to buy it and why it's really something we can't afford not to buy, etc. So again, if green is not achievable for securitization, and I mean green, not real green, not green that necessarily helps the planet, but green as defined by the rules, as defined by the taxonomy, as defined by the European Green Bond Standard, as defined by the EBA for the green asset ratio. If you can't get yourself into the green bucket, or getting yourself into the green bucket is going to be far too expensive, and is therefore not commercially feasible, then I think you're going to find it harder and harder to sell securitizations in Europe. So here's this slide is just a little bit of a summary about information requirements. If you're a fund, SFDR, as I said, if you're a bank at NFRD, 449A, and ultimately the green asset ratio, you're going to need this information. And in addition, as I said, if you don't, your investments don't meet green, you may be very disinclined to buy them unless they provide an enormous risk-reward, positive risk-reward. Here, I've stolen this, by the way, with attribution from the EBA's own paper. This gives you a nice, again, I'm not going to go through this. This is just a summary of all the things we've discussed, but it shows you the two things. It shows you the complexity of the things that are coming or that are already here. As we said, NFRD, SFD are already here. The complexity and the interaction, the way all of these things sort of link together, and in an indirect way. So remember we said we're going to talk about the indirect way in which regulation is going to impact securitization. These are the indirect ways in which regulation is going to impact securitization.
For today? I mean, if I'm issuing today, or are these all future rules?
Yes, so NFRD applies today. SFDR, although technically coming into force in June 2022, is going to be for a reporting period of 1 year, like accountancy, so effectively it applies today. 449A is still in discussion, but there is little doubt, there's no pushback. So there's little doubt that it will come into force, but it is not technically yet into force. And the green asset ratio, similarly, is not yet technically legally into force. But again, it's very unlikely that it will not come into force very, very soon. So we've gone through the regulations that apply to effectively investors in securitization, and that will therefore indirectly impact those investors. Now we'd like to talk about specifically securitization rules. So already the existing rule, Article 46 of the STS regulation, says that for RMBS and autos, you have to disclose available information. So this is already the law for STS transactions in those two asset classes. However, it doesn't have really much bite because you only have to disclose available information, and the EBA has given you, given us a fairly helpful definition of available, which is available in centralized registries. So it could have got a lot worse if available had been defined as something you can find out after huge amounts of due diligence and work, but that is not the case. Okay. So, two things. First of all, for STS, the EBA has been requested it's basically the ESAs, but effectively it will be the EBA, has been requested to provide a proposal for a new regulatory technical standard to be passed by the Commission, European Commission, which sets out in much greater detail the information that needs to be made available for STS transactions in reference to sustainability. And again, I'm not going to read this, but we put it there for you to refer to. In another article in the amendment, these two things, by the way, just to be clear, 26D6 and 45A were introduced in the new amendment to the securitization regulation, the amendment that allowed synthetic securitizations to be STS and allowed easier NPL transactions to be done. Those two requests were there. There is a further request to the EBA to propose a draft for another regulatory technical standard to be passed by the European Commission, this time broadly on sustainability disclosure for all securitizations. Now, in terms of the timing, the STS, going back one slide, the STS proposal was supposed to be in July. EBA missed that deadline. The general disclosure on sustainability for securitizations was supposed to be in November. The EBA said they want to do the STS first. There's been a consultation or call for advice by the EBA on the second one, but since they're going to do the STS one first and they still haven't come out with the STS one, I think it's fairly certain that the November deadline is going to be missed. And I suspect that this is not going to come out as a proposal from the EBA before 2022. I'd be surprised if it came in 2021. I think the first one on the STS sustainability disclosure will probably come out this year or very early in 2022. But I think the one on sustainability disclosures for securitizations generally will wait until 2022. And then, of course, it has to be discussed by the Commission and passed. But those are very specific legislative drafts that are going to target securitization specifically. And in addition, and for this I will pass it on to Max, in addition, of course, we have the European Green Bond Standard, which we talked a number of slides before, which is going to define what is a European Green Bond. And it is becoming clear that not only a securitization has to be able to be a European Green Bond, but that there are a number of controversies building up, which have actually exploded onto the scene, about how a securitization will be able to be green under the European Green Bond Standard. And Max, probably, if you want to take us through that.
Well, if you look at the regulation, the Green Bond Standard, there are in the draft regulation around green bonds and green securitization, there are, as with all legislation and regulation, there are differences of opinion between legislators, regulators, market participants, and stakeholders. And I can remember in the crafting of the STS regulation, there were disputes over draft proposals, which, if these proposals would have gone into the law, the result would have been a bright and shiny regulation, completely killing the market. So it's important for all stakeholders to actively engage in this regulation process. As Ian said, there are controversial elements in there, elements which will define whether or not green securitization can add to the green bond goals. And if you look at we're not going into all the disputes, but we'll now limit ourselves to the two most important and contentious battlegrounds, if you want. And number one is the use of proceeds. And it may be the most contentious one in the discussion. And the question is whether is a green securitization, is that a securitization of green assets? In other words, it is only green if the assets are green? Or is it about the proceeds that go to fund green projects and green activities? And the opinions are divided. The side that says assets should be green, otherwise it's not a green securitization, has some arguments for that. One, it is simple. It's a simple definition. It makes some intuitive sense as well. And it means that, and some investors care for that, is that investors are repaid out of green cash. While these are true, there are other arguments against it. For one, it is inconsistent with the core definition of the EU Green Bond Standard. And on another level, it requires more from securitizations than from any other capital market instrument, including on how investors are repaid. And what I personally find the most important objection here is that it requires securitization to wait basically until parts of the transition are completed and then refinance those parts. So instead of being able to finance the ongoing and upcoming parts of the green transition, it would only be a refinance after the fact. And therefore, it limits the amounts that are available in this critical phase in the process of the green transition. And really, I personally don't see a visible benefit of it. So that's one of the most important battlegrounds as well. The other one is more of a general nature, which we have discussed many times before, as PCS. The playing field between securitization and other types of bonds, corporate bonds, covered bonds, is very much unlevel in a number of ways. Disclosure, all kinds of other requirements, and without a meaningful reason as well, in my opinion. So the argument that we have made many times before is that there should be no separate regulation for securitization vis-a-vis other comparable instruments, unless there are compelling arguments to do that. And the same goes here for the regulation regarding green bonds. The EBA is looking into, on the request of the EU, on the Commission, into the question whether there is a need for a separate green securitization regulation. There may be elements where this is useful, but in general, we argue that there should be no separate regulation unless there are really, really good arguments for that. And sustainable regulation, if you would specifically make green securitization regulation, it might add to this issue. And we discussed the definition of green. And there are disclosure requirements and also the interaction between SCS and green. So in general, our argument is don't make any difference unless there's good arguments. And in this respect, if we're talking about battlegrounds, if we're talking about things that matter in the draft regulation that are important to allow green securitization to play a big role in the green transition, there are a number of elements that need very much attention. And PCS will, in the near term this year, we will publish a paper on green securitization in which we will elaborate on these battlegrounds and other issues that we think are important for the development of the European green securitization market.
Yes, those battlegrounds could make or break securitization going forward. But one thing I find it interesting, Ian, so far disclosure, it's mandatory, but you don't have to do anything. If you don't do anything, there seems to be no penalty apart from maybe some investors won't buy your bond, but there are no carrots and sticks. I mean, the legislation is completely mute about it. It's just please report if you want to, or in some extent, yes, you could call it that way. It's like not mandatory completely. Yeah.
Okay, so that's correct. One way in which you can look at this is that for the moment it's all about disclosing things, being transparent, and even the European Green Bond Standard it's been very clear. The Commission has said it's not a mandatory standard. What it means by not being a mandatory standard is that there's nothing preventing you from calling your bond a green bond. You can't call it a European Green Bond Standard green bond, but you could say, I have my own standard and I think it meets the requirements of that standard. So for the moment, it all seems very loose, and it relies currently primarily on moral persuasion, right? You think that investors will want to invest in green, and you're therefore saying all we're doing is really preventing greenwashing, we're creating a standardized definition. The general view, we could all be wrong, the general view has often been wrong in history, but the general view is that this is just stage one. There is a belief amongst those who watch this carefully that the Commission and political entities in Europe have deliberately decided not to have any carrots and sticks at this stage, because disclosing in advance the carrots and sticks starts to influence negatively the process of definition. And what I mean by that is, let's imagine, and I'm not saying that this is going to be a proposal, but let's imagine that somebody had said, we will, for insurance companies, under Solvency II, which sets out the capital that insurance companies are required to hold, for insurance companies, we will halve the capital requirement if you invest in a green instrument. So whatever the capital requirement for an equity is, we'll halve the capital if that's a green equity bond, we'll halve the capital. The problem then becomes that when you start asking people, whether in industry or in the regulatory community, what do you think a green bond should be? The process is they don't ask themselves, what should a green bond be? They ask themselves, what kind of bond would I like to see half capital reduced? From a prudential, and so a prudential regulator may say, I really don't like the idea of capital being reduced by 50%, so I'm going to define green bond in a way that's unachievable. And from industry, people will say, I would love to have half in my books, capital half. I'm going to try to get as wide a definition as possible. So there is a sense in which no carrots and sticks were outlined at this stage of the process because we didn't want, the European Union, European Commission didn't want those carrots and sticks to influence the process of definition and the process of disclosure. But the energy behind green and sustainability and the transformation of the European economy towards a sustainable basis is so strong. And we have heard, even the ECB, Christine Lagarde, say, our role as central bank should be to some extent to help that process of transitioning to sustainability, which is amazing if you think about the actual mandate of the ECB, which is an extremely narrow mandate. The powerful political forces behind sustainability are such that it is actually not believed by most people that there will be no carrots and there will be no sticks, no penalties for non-green assets, no benefits for green assets. We don't know what those will be yet, and I think there's going to be a huge debate over that, but it would be unlikely that in a couple of years' time you will not have regulatory and legislative penalties, regulatory and legislative benefits, depending on whether your assets are green or not. And that even further raises the stake for the securitization industry to make sure that we can, in a workable way, have our products be green. Because already you can see in the disclosure side and in the green asset ratio and the disclosure under SFDR, you can already see the moral suasion, the moral push for people not to buy non-green assets. But we think that's actually going to get much worse, because we think in a couple of years' time, added to those moral pressures, which we approve of, by the way. I mean, PCS is very much in favor of the transition to sustainability as quickly as possible and as effectively as possible. But in addition, we think in addition to these moral pressures, there will be real legislative and prudential pressures. And so again, it is absolutely essential that we can find a way where securitization can have a niche in the ecology of sustainable finance in Europe.
We already had one question asked. I think two of them we already asked. But one question is, some people argue that there should be a percentage of assets that need to be green because there are not enough assets to do that, like a transition period. And more people are talking, okay, let's over a transition period allow not assets to be 100% green. What is your view on that? I mean, what are your comments on that?
Well, if I may, I think it's a question that has been around for a long time. We've experienced that with the Green Storm as well. And back in the beginning of the Green RMBS by Option, the feeling with a lot of investors was that assets should be green, because there was not much knowledge at that point in time, and just to be sure, because then you're absolutely sure that it's a green bond. And there are some people still who are what I call purists, who say, well, the assets has to be green. On the other hand, increasingly over the years, there have been investors who saw basically, and who stressed that the transition actually is what is needed to finance, in the sense that if you look at, for instance, an RMBS, what is qualifying under the green bond principles and the CBI standards is not just A label and B label, the two best energy efficiency labels, but also houses were eligible and were considered as green assets that came from, let's say, G and went to C, improving 3 notches, 30%, etc. And actually, that is what I personally think is what is needed the most. If you stick to RMBS, the housing stock in Europe is by far not energy efficient. The biggest part is not energy efficient and needs to become energy efficient. So that is where we should focus our efforts. And so that is also having a great impact on reduction of carbon emission. So the stimulation and the need for greening houses, greening cars, is extremely important, and that's why we believe that use of proceeds is necessary if green securitization want to play a role in the transition. And also, everybody is complaining left and right. Both issuers and investors are complaining there are not enough green assets to create green bonds. So if you have to wait until the green assets are there, we're losing valuable time, which we simply don't have. And the way going forward, in my opinion, is either to think about a transition period, so you can get to work now in greening the society and finance that by green securitization, or you can allow a certain percentage. I mean, we have to think about ways to do it, but I think I'm absolutely sure there are ways to get around this. And also, use of proceeds is acceptable in other green bonds, meaning that the issuer has to disclose the stringent disclosure requirements. If you have a bank, a corporate bond or a covered bond, you have to disclose where the money is going. And I don't see any reason why you couldn't have that with a green securitization. The issuer is fully capable. Basically, you might have an issuer, if you have a bank who issued green covered bonds and is allowed the use of proceeds approach with the disclosure that comes with it, and wouldn't be allowed to do the same with a green securitization bond. That would be very, very odd. And the question, the person who asked the question is right. We need to move forward either with a transition period and or a mixed, hybrid
another question we have: do you believe that green data from issuers will be centralized in somewhere like EDW and some other loan data information, or you think that's not going to be centralized, or you don't?
That depends very much. Okay, so that depends very much on the legislation. Certainly, we know that there have been talks. We know we've talked certainly with EDW. We know they're looking at it. It sort of would make a lot of sense, I have to say, for centralized data, because you could then use it and collate it, and also data repositories do a checking job, which I think is very useful. but that will depend very much on where the legislation goes. So we don't know at this stage. But yes, it's certainly a possibility, and it's certainly a possibility that's already been looked at.
That PCS can become an external reviewer as defined in the EU taxonomy, green bond taxonomy.
We don't really know what the regulations will be, what the requirements will be. We are primarily a securitization shop, but you know, we have a social mandate. As you know, we're not for profit with a social mandate to help securitization. Certainly, helping green securitization would be a way of helping securitization. So we don't rule it out, but it's very early to think about this.
It doesn't matter because you are effectively issuing.
Okay, yeah. So I think we need to clarify what we mean by a transition period. PCS is very strongly of the view that a proceeds-based analysis, so your money raised through your securitization is going to go to green projects, meeting the taxonomy definition, is the way to go for green securitization. We think that logically, philosophically, but also in terms of mobilizing money to transition the European economy to a sustainable basis, it makes no sense at all in a period where there are virtually no green assets. That's the whole point. We need green assets. There are virtually no green assets. It makes no sense at all to have a assets-based analysis. The idea of a transition, however, is that as you move the European economy towards the kind of economy that is generating green assets, green mortgages, green auto loans, green project financing, etc., etc. As you do transition to a green economy, then you can imagine an end world where in 2050, 2055, a green securitization will be defined as a securitization of green assets. Once you have those green assets, once we are well into the transition to a sustainable economy. So what we're talking about in a transition period is not a transition period on a given deal, because the idea that today you have virtually no green mortgages, as Max pointed out, but that within the life of a deal, which is about 7 years, 5 to 7 years for a mortgage deal, you know, you're somehow going to generate masses of green assets. That's not going to happen. So when we talk about transition period, I think what we're saying is we should have definitely have a proceeds-based definition of green for securitization for a period, and that's a serious period, i.e., well into the transition, maybe 10 years, 12 years, 15 years. And then we revise it. When you start seeing the generation of green assets, where it becomes much more feasible to maybe have a definition of green securitization as a green asset-based securitization, then we can change it. And we can even maybe say today, for the first 10 years, it will be this. For the next 5 years, so first 10 years is proceeds-based. Next 5 years, it's at least 25 or 30%. The next 5 years after that, it's 75. And by 2050, it's 100%. That's what we're talking about when we talk about transition.
If I may add, Ian, there was one question that read, how can the use of proceeds be monitored? And I would like to have a counter question. Do we ask this question for a green covered bond, for example? And the answer is yes, we do. And there are ways in which an issue of a green covered bond is obliged to monitor and to disclose and to report the use of the proceeds. So if this bank issues a covered bond, a green covered bond, there are requirements, obviously, to report on the use of the proceeds and to make sure that these are in line with the taxonomy, in line with other regulations, etc. So my question would be, why couldn't you do that with an issuer, the same bank issuing a green bond? Of course, it's possible. I think there are ways to ensure that the proceeds of a green securitization are effectively used for green and taxonomy-aligned projects. So that is something that is, again, no offense to the person who asked the question, We don't ask this question for covered bond, for corporate bonds, etc. Corporates, if they issue a green bond, are required to disclose this and to monitor and report
Thanks,
on
Max. I
use
think
of
that this is
proceeds.
a question you probably will
Then
be
why
able to
wouldn't we
answer.
do that for a green bond?
Based on
A
existing
green
requirements for
securitization.
STS,
It's the same way.
RMBS, what's the capacity of, you think, of banks to disclose green data, green information regarding to the property they have financed? So if that is not really required, that's not the question that, you know, the disclosure requirements need from banks to provide as issuers of bonds. Max or Ian? Existing requirements for STS or MBS, what is the capacity of banks to disclose green
Can you repeat the
information,
question,
green
please?
data?
I saw the question, yeah. I mean, that's one of the debates that has been raging for a number of years now. And banks and issuers, I mean, in my former life, I was an issuer. We always have been arguing, we are totally willing to disclose whatever information we can find on the greenness or the sustainability of our assets. But not all the information is registered as yet. In the Netherlands and in Europe, basically now, it's European-wide regulation to have energy efficiency certificates. But there are huge differences in between countries where this is available, this information or not. But it's possible to register those qualifications. For example, in the Netherlands, it's mandatory. Every house you sell, you have to have an energy efficiency report and an energy efficient label. So, but going forward, that information will improve. There is already a lot of information. But one thing we always have argued regarding disclosure requirements is that you shouldn't, as a regulator, ask for a lot of things that are simply not available. And banks are more than willing to report whatever information they have about sustainability of their loans. But you have to be careful not to limit, in this phase of the green transition, to limit the possibility of green finance by imposing information requirements which simply cannot be met by banks and others.
If I could add something to that, I would say a lot of this ties back to one of the slides that we had, and it also ties back to comments and positions we've taken at PCS for a while, which is that of level playing field. What really concerns us, well, one of the things that really concerns us is that because there's already regulation around securitization keeps being asked to do things that no one else is asked to do. So when it comes to disclosure, we are very supportive of disclosure, but we're very supportive of disclosure across the board. So to the extent that disclosure is required in securitization, it should be required in covered bonds. It should be required in corporate bonds. The same goes, and I think Max made the point very well about use of proceeds. Yes, use of proceeds is a huge issue, and it's been a huge issue ever since the ICMA green bond standards came out, the Climate Bond Initiative green standards came out. How do you track money? Money is fungible. Somebody says he's raising money for a project. How do you know he's really raising it for the project? These are all very difficult and knotty questions, but they're knotty and difficult for all green bonds. And therefore, again, whatever, how do you do it for securitization? If I may be allowed to be a bit flippant, I don't know. How do you do it for corporate bonds? However they do it, we'll do it that way too. And I think that is important, that we do not end up, again, with disclosure requirements that are different from any other asset class, even without any justification. Capital requirements are different from every asset class at the same level of risk. requirements, process requirements, procedural
One question we
requirements,
have is,
auditing
do you believe
requirements that are
future
different from
currency
every other
stakes will
asset
be
class. I
linked to
think
the,
our biggest
green
plea when
bond
it comes from
standard and
ESG and
the
securitization is
taxonomy?
just treat us like everyone else.
Whether the future currency stakes will be linked to the green bond standard, European green bond standard, and the EU taxonomy.
What will be linked? Yes. Yes, absolutely, absolutely. There is no doubt that any mention going forward of green financing, green investment, green bond standards, any carrots, any stakes provided for in the European framework will be based on the taxonomy and the EU green bond standard. And by the way, I mean, it was on the slide, we didn't mention it orally. The green bond standard is designed to be applicable to non-EU issuers, right? So if you're an American company or a Japanese company issuing a corporate bond, which you want to be green, if it wants to be treated as green in Europe, it will have to meet the European Union green bond standard. There is no talk, absolutely no talk of anything like an equivalence or treating somebody else's standards as green.
How investors are currently
Guaranteed, everything green in the capital markets will be tied to the European green bond standard and the taxonomy. Is what we hear from issuers. Investors are all at this stage, it would seem, either not really asking for information, or if they ask for information, one of the I wouldn't say complaints, but things that we hear from originators, is that everybody's asking different questions and want information in different formats. So there really is at this stage a lot of uncertainty, a lot of groping around, and there's no doubt that we're going to need some standardization soon, because otherwise it's just not going to be possible to operate this. Ultimately, we need to transition the European economy to a sustainable basis. We need to transform the world economy to a sustainable basis. There will be costs. I mean, anybody who thinks we can transition to a sustainable basis and save the planet from 2, 3, 4 degrees of increased temperature is living in a delusion. Yes, there will be costs. How those costs are shared, who gets to bear those costs, both internationally and within the European Union. And of course, we haven't spoken about the UK because the UK is now out of the European Union. Those are huge political questions. But yes, there will be costs.
Clear requirements in terms of reporting, and the investors have been preparing for that. It's just that the lack of unity, the lack of reporting is difficult. We've had discussions with investors around Article 5 of STS. When STS came into force, investors were all looking for, how do I perform my duties under Article 5, because it was spectacularly unclear how an investor should do that. And it has been by some education and some cooperation between investors and also PCS try to play a role there, that we sort of developed a common ground how you could do that. And I see similar things happening. I think that investors should collectively, in their trade associations and what have you, in the gatherings, discuss this to try to get some uniformity. Otherwise, issuers will go crazy because they will have 25 different questionnaires from investors in their deals. And I think the ball is in the court of the investors mainly.
We'll take one more question
get
because I
together
think we are
and try to
running out of time.
standardize.
Ian, the last question was on ABCP.
Get a standardized view on how things are reported.
How do you knit ABCP funding with green, since ABCP funding, ABCP conduits may have 20, 30, 40, 50 deals inside, but there's only one issuance of ABCP. I think it is a challenge. I don't think it's a challenge that is not capable of being overcome. First of all, if you look at how STS works for ABCP, it's done at the transaction level. I mean, there is a provision for a whole STS conduit, but nobody has ever done that, and I think there are good reasons why nobody probably ever will do that. So the STS analysis is done at the transaction level. It's entirely possible to do the ESG at a transaction level. Then what that means is, obviously, you could have an ESG-only conduit that only does ESG compliant, sustainability compliant transactions. But there is another interesting possibility, which is that the conduit could issue 2 tranches, if you want, of commercial paper, which will run pari passu. So from a credit point of view, they're backed by the same overall pool. But if 50% of your funding in the ABCP conduit is sustainability compatible, it is entirely possible, if you want to issue 2 classes. You can have some green commercial paper and non-green commercial paper. Again, from a credit standpoint, they'd be pari passu, but from the taxonomy compliant basis at the back, 50% would be green and could be bought in green funds, and 50% would not be green and would therefore not be bought in green funds. And there would likely be some pricing differential. So I'm not saying it's easy,
our goal today,
but I certainly don't think it's impossible.
Show you like a overview of where we stand today in sustainable finance, how you are affected already today, what is coming, and where we should pay as an industry quite a lot of attention to make sure that securitization can play the role it needs to play in the transition period to a greener and more sustainable finance and not be sidelined. Thank you, everyone, and hope to see you soon on the next PCS Insights session. Bye. Bye.
Bye.